Welcome. It's great to have a good number of people here for this session on HIV resourcing and sustainability in a world of competing resources. For those of you who are sitting at the back, please get up and please move forward, because what we want this session to do is for us to have a conversation. And I think if you're right at the back, we can't have a conversation in the same way as if you could come forward. So please do just move forward if you're in the back rows. And we very much welcome you to come to the front. There's a bit of inertia, but please do come forward. Come on, or I might run out there and grab you, and that would be really embarrassing for me and you. Great, thank you. I can see some movement. I appreciate it. Okay, so for those of you who know Richard Horton, you'll clearly see that I am not Richard Horton. Unfortunately, Richard has a health issue and so isn't able to attend today, excuse me, but sends his sincere apologies. I'm going to boldly stand in and take his place. So my name is Charlotte Watts, and I'm the chief scientist at DFID. So in my role, I'm very much engaged in issues around and discussions about how do we allocate development resource and achieve the most impact across different geographies, across investments in health, HIV, including HIV, TB, but also across a range of different other areas of development. So the topics that we're going to discuss now are very pertinent to the issues that actually in our day-to-day business at DFID we're really grappling with and trying to think through and to share sort of insights with our ministers. We have a great panel lined up for you today. So we have Professor Anna Vassal. Anna is a professor in health economics and leads the Economic Evaluation and Priority Setting Group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And she also holds the Ute Langer at the Institute for Global Health. So Anna is our expert in all things health financing on the panel. We're also very privileged and pleased to have Minister Venko Filipce from Macedonia. The minister is a neurosurgeon by clinical background and now leads the Ministry of Health in Macedonia and has a background of doing a lot of work in issues around health system strengthening. And thirdly, we have Harvey Feldbaum, and Harvey is head of strategy and policy at the Global Fund. Harvey led the development of the 2017 to 22 Global Fund strategy, and he's now involved in overseeing its implementation, and that includes all aspects around thinking through allocation decisions and also the approach to transition financing. So the way that we've structured the session today is that we are going to ask each person to come up and do a 5-minute presentation. And then we're going to really try and have a discussion. I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to encourage each of the panelists to also have a discussion between themselves, and then really open it up to the floor and ask people to engage and have a joint conversation around this really important question about resourcing and global sustainability in a world of competing priorities. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anna to kick us off. Anna. So thanks, Anna. I'm glad that you had one sort of positive after those quite sobering realities of what we need to engage in when we're thinking about health investment. Okay, well now pass over and invite the Minister to come up and present. And I should have mentioned earlier, the Minister has to leave at 3:30 to catch a plane, so he'll be here for part of the discussion, but will then need to leave at 3:30. Minister.
Thank you. Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, in our country, Republic of Macedonia, as donor funding is phasing out, the Ministry of Health and the government recognize the need for national ownership and sustainability of the national HIV response. The incidence rate of HIV in the general population has remained low, but the incidence rate among the key population, especially among gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men, has been increasing over the years. This year, the Ministry of Health has fully overtaken the funding of the national HIV program and interventions. In 2018, the government of the Republic of Macedonia allocated 1.5 million euros, or 3.5 times more compared to last year. The Ministry of Health has been actively engaged in the past period together with the civil society organizations to establish a mechanism to enable the allocation of funds for prevention and early detection of HIV among the affected people in the country. In this regard, the Republic of Macedonia became a leader in the region in terms of government financing of the national HIV response. Furthermore, the country has allocated an appropriate budget to ensure continuous procurement of antiretroviral therapy, as well as the implementation of new policies for prevention programs. In cooperation with civil society organizations, we continue to work to find a long-term and sustainable mechanism for financing of the HIV preventive programs. Our goal is to establish an institutional framework that will guarantee financial sustainability in the future and to continue improving the infection control in our country. For successful HIV financing and sustainability in the world of competing priorities, governments need to commit to domestic finance and provide access to HIV treatment for all. To do this, it is crucial to sustain the involvement of civil society and affected communities. Services provided by societies and community-based organizations to reach the affected people are increasingly recognized as an integral part of the country's health and social system. By investing in HIV prevention in the long run, we are investing in the control of the infection. By investing in early detection of HIV and early initiation of treatment, we are investing in improving the long-term health outcome of people living with HIV and reducing costs associated with the treatment of opportunistic infections. In addition, we recognize the state funding must continue to increase. In this way, we will guarantee the long-term sustainability of the programs and we will serve a greater number of affected citizens. Funding is an important element, but it should be accompanied by further promotion of human rights protection. In the upcoming period, we will continue to introduce modern antiretroviral drugs and tests for monitoring the infection to ensure that people are adherent to the treatment and that we maintain and further improve the high level of viral suppression. It is also time to provide a system that will not condemn nor will discriminate against people living with or are affected by HIV. Only this way we will guarantee the protection and the realization of basic human rights. One of the greatest challenges that remains at this time is the access to primary health services by the key population due to stigma among the healthcare workers. In the coming period, we will also work on HIV education and public awareness raising. Despite many challenges ahead, I believe that our country will show strong political will and readiness to contribute to the achievement of United Nations Sustainable Developmental Goals. We all agreed that by the year 2030, we'll end HIV epidemics and one of the key public health issues. Continuous strong support from international partners, including the European Union, the Global Fund, and private donors, is needed to achieve increased domestic financing. This will contribute to ensuring a successful transition and program and financial sustainability of services for key and vulnerable populations provided by the civil society and community-based organizations. Last but not least, the goal is early diagnosis, linkage to care and viral suppression of people living with HIV in our country through universal access to prevention, treatment, care and support, based on the fundamental principle to respect of human rights and non-discrimination. Thank you.
So thank you, Minister. I think Macedonia is really leading the way in making the commitment to funding HIV, and I think it's really impressive in terms of the commitment to CBOs and the protection of human rights. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, and now our third presenter, Harley. So Harley is going to speak from the Global Fund's perspective on this.
Sure. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, panelists. Welcome, everybody. First, just noting we're missing our colleague Rico Gustav today, who's part of the community delegation at the Global Fund, and it's one of the great things about the Global Fund model that all of the work from the country level to the board level is done in consultation with full active, and I mean active, participation by communities. And I see some of his colleagues in the audience here. I assume you'll be just as loud here as you are at our board. So just noting that we miss Rico today. 3 overall points, and then before we start a discussion. First, we do have to look at, when we look at financing in middle-income countries, we have to look at how the development landscape has changed since we really started this fight, since the Global Fund was created in 2002. Back then, in 2002, there were 62 low-income countries. Does anyone know how many there are today? Quick guess? I heard 30. Excellent. 31. Although I think, depending on your data, you may actually be right and I may be wrong. So that points to some major changes that have happened in economic growth over the period of which we've been really at a global level fighting this disease. The disease burden has likewise migrated, not physically, but with those countries as they've increased in income level. So this points to two really big changes we need to consider as we adapt our response to the HIV epidemic. First, the Global Fund is doing this, but we all need to work differently in middle-income countries. We need to get domestic financing moving and going to the right places. There are huge gains possible if we can mobilize more tax resources in developing countries, which has got to be the least sexy but most important thing in the development landscape. There are huge gains possible if countries that have low prioritization of health increase their prioritization and move more funding into the health space. And we've got countries, including some of our biggest high-burden countries, which both collect very little money in terms of domestic tax mobilization and then spend very little of that little amount of money on health. And that is a clear sustainability problem that cannot be addressed without fixing those two parts of the domestic financing landscape. And is exactly right, of course, the efficiency of programs is also a huge gain, which we can do better, and I think there's been a lot of talk of this at the conference. The second conclusion from that landscape and the shift from 62 to 31 low-income countries is also not what we'll talk about today, but it's those countries that are remaining in low-income country status. About half of them are there because they're in active conflict or are fragile states. That points to a very different group of people who have been left behind. They've been left behind MDG progress for the last 15 years. They're starting to be left behind SDG progress. And we need new and different ways of working to get at those populations that suffer in those countries. This is a much more flexible, much more humanitarian approach. Happy to talk about that separately, but it's not the topic for today. Second big point is that the Global Fund has recognized a lot of these challenges. In our last strategy, and we did a lot of research, consulted, and adopted what we call a sustainability transition and co-financing policy in 2016 and are now putting it in place. The broad outlines of it, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, the need to address sustainability across the portfolio, not just in transitioning countries. That transition is hard and takes time. Some 10 years, we did a study of the previous transitions the Global Fund had went through, and not all were working as well as we have in Macedonia. So we learned a lot of lessons from that. We now publish transition projections, so countries have awareness of when they may be approaching transition. In most countries that are in that cohort, we've started at implementing transition readiness assessments that look at the key barriers to transition, the bottlenecks, whether it's social contracting or procurement or other types of funding community organizations, or some of the political barriers we know exist in a lot of these countries. We have continued and ramped up our co-financing requirements, getting at the point about how critical domestic financing is. 15% of every Global Fund grant requires co-financing from the government. And 15% is the minimum. It goes up to 30%, where we've got countries that, again, collect little in tax revenue and then spend little on health, where we know we have a major sustainability gap. And then we've really strengthened the requirements of our funding. So in lower middle income countries, we require that countries have to use the Global Fund financing at least 50% for key and vulnerable populations. And it's 100% for key and vulnerable populations in upper income countries. This is because in these countries, and I think this will be the topic for today, the problems are less funding based and more political. And so we have to drive our funding to those places. Third major point is that we do face some major challenges in our grants and globally in the HIV response, where countries have the ability to pay but not the political will to address the epidemics they actually have. The political trajectories in the world are not all going in the right direction in terms of being inclusive, rights-based, openness to migrants, and the political, human rights, and discriminatory environment that provide barriers to care for people seeking HIV services. The Global Fund is doing a lot, and we're happy to talk about more we can do to improve this work. In addition to what I talked about above, there is a lot of other activities, including some $50 million in regional grants specifically to get at the transition needs for key and vulnerable populations in key regions. We work really closely with UNAIDS to try and improve key population size estimates, because if you don't know who you're trying to help, you have trouble doing it. You have trouble getting governments to recognize it. We use the incidence metrics to the extent they exist for key populations epidemics when we allocate funds. And we have some $45 million going to human rights interventions to reduce human rights barriers to care, not only for HIV, but also for TB and malaria. But the ultimate responsibility is on governments, and so we do need communities, the politics, the pressure that's been so successful in the history of the HIV response to continue, because it's only when we have better tools and also when we treat people better that we will get to the end of this epidemic. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Harley. I mean, I think it's really good to hear a bit more about the way that the Global Fund is thinking about this and clearly recognizing the issues around key populations and the political aspect of this and the challenge around human rights protection as being critical. Okay, now we're going to go into our discussion. I've got a few kickoff questions, but I want you all to get your pens ready or your brains working and think about what are the questions you want to ask our panelists too. I'm going to work down the row. So Anna, you mentioned clearly we have many competing health demands, let alone demands across the SDGs. One of the issues that's come up in the discussions over this conference is, can we make a case for more investment in health, right? So is that one of our strategies, linked to universal health coverage, is if we could increase that health envelope, can that be a strategy that we could do to bring in other allies, but then also to try and protect the resources that go to HIV and TB? What's your thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I hope the microphone's working, yes. I can hear myself. No, I mean, I hope the example of Malawi and maybe other countries shows that I think we have no choice but to make the case for investment in health. If we stay with making the case just for investment within HIV, the example of Malawi, for example, showed me we will never, in the universal health coverage debate, never prioritize all the services we think are important for people. In terms of making the case for health, if you look at work, say, for example, done by the Copenhagen Consensus, which brings together economists from a whole range of different areas and a whole range of different sectors, it's actually been relatively easy to make that case on economic grounds. You find consistently, again, health interventions, be it HIV, TB, or child interventions, come top of those lists, also areas like nutrition. Part of the way that we make that case is not just in terms of economic productivity, because sometimes that's difficult for different groups, but also is that health is something that we value in itself. And when you start to bring that in, the case becomes stronger. So I think there's a good case to be made. I don't think it's always listened to. As you know, many countries at the moment are keeping their health budgets, and you talked about the lack of prioritization in health, and the overall budget is probably one of the biggest gains, but are not listening to that case. But there's a case we should be making and making louder.
So it's the moral as well as the economic, is that it?
I think it's the moral, but it's also focusing on social gain. We do need to have economic productivity gains, which are clear, but also we need to sort of value social investment itself and keep that debate going. We may have stepped back slightly from that, but
so is that
investing in the social, education, health, and social development, and not just economic development.
Okay, great, thanks. Take notes if anybody wants to come back and ask questions later. Okay, Minister, I was really impressed by the way that you were talking about mobilizing government funding and deploying that to fund civil society and to make sure that there is a response and services for key populations. How did you pull that off politically?
It was a political will that was brought over with the new government 1 year ago. We simply recognized the advantage of collaborating with civil society organizations, recognizing their knowledge, their expertise, and their experience working in this field, their ability to reach the end users in the focal groups. And since this already shows some results, we don't want to stop here. We want to go beyond this point. We simply want to replicate the model in some other fields of primary healthcare, but also change the legislation so this can become a sustainable model. So in future, it won't depend on the political will of any government, the system to become simply the integrated part of the health system in our country.
Great. And so that's the social contracting approach that...
Yep.
And how is it going? I mean, you were saying that you've had some success. Are there other lessons that are coming out of that?
It's still beginning, but I think it's showing results. We had a great meeting in Skopje with the Global Fund, and we raised the question about future collaboration with the Global Fund, where in the countries where they withdraw their support. And we're discussing the opportunity to develop a model on how to do evaluation or monitoring of this social contracting mechanism, just to be sure that signs of failure are recognized very early. So I think that this is a future direction in which we should go, just to re-establish our relation and maybe develop another collaboration in some other direction now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on to Harley. Harley, you know, what's in everybody's mind when we think about the Global Fund is that we're coming up to replenishment. What are you going to say to convince donors to continue support or maybe increase support to the fund, given the agenda around UHC?
Great, good question. I think so I was in the Obama administration when we hosted the 2013 replenishment, and the replenishment dance is multi-levels, and you either have to, so there's a number of things you need to say. At the highest level, you either need someone who believes in the Global Fund and believes in stepping up. We had that in the Obama administration. Trudeau did it at our last replenishment, and Macron has stepped forward marvelously for the next one. So we've got really good high-level support. You need domestic political pressure, so the advocacy is absolutely critical. It starts off with generating some fear and hopefully shifts as the government steps up to celebrating the successes of the administration who's done really good things. And you need a few people on the inside to help make that process work who believe in the Global Fund. At a lower down, more technical level, which I think is where your question was going, we need to show a bunch of different things. I think part of where we've adjusted is showing how we're adapted to the development landscape. We're no longer, as we were 5-6 years ago, doing things the same in Nigeria as we do in El Salvador. We've really moved our funding for focusing on the fragile states, focusing on the big high-burden countries where our partnerships with other big bilateral donors is key, to this really tailored work on transition and sustainability. The debate with UHC is really critical, and I think Peter Piet's talk this morning was an interesting prelude to that, both very positive, both noting the win-win situations, but also the, I hope you noticed the very clear statement that thousands to millions of people would die if we simply just shifted and hoped that UHC would work. Just picking up on the minister's point, some of the most effective Global Fund programs I've seen are the really small community-based ones. One in El Salvador I'm recalling now was for transgender women in a clinic that was particularly friendly to transgender women who were being killed as they walked from gang area to gang area. And there was only one place they could go, so if the gang lines moved, they were literally at risk of murder. It was a tiny program, it was like under $200,000, but one of the most effective ones. And it points to when you talk about UHC, you're not just thinking about kind of a big health insurance scheme and we're done. You really do have to integrate the community systems who, as the minister said, reach people who the government often can't reach. On the other hand, we are seeing some successful starts of transitions. The Vietnam case is a really interesting one where PEPFAR funding is declining, Global Fund funding is declining but slightly slower, but we're transitioning a lot of the ARV cohort onto the National Health Insurance Program, which is a terrific sustainability intervention. So there's a lot of good news, I think, on the technical side. The only final thing I'd say is that we are falling behind on the fight against each of the 3 diseases we work on. We have a resurgence of malaria, and we have way too many missing cases, and way too little declines in incidence for TB. And we see the risks in terms of incidence not being addressed well enough in key and vulnerable populations, not enough coverage and viral suppression to get to a turning point in the epidemic. And the Global Fund is the most scalable instrument the world has today to increase resources in those fights and ultimately succeed.
That's quite a good pitch. Okay, Anna, you study health systems. You look at that financing. You did the economic evaluation of the Avahan program. That was a large-scale delivery of targeted sex worker programs and for other key populations. Do you think really health systems, that UHC will get to this point where it can reach and deliver services to very marginalized, vulnerable key populations?
I don't know. I mean, it depends how you... Do I think it ever will? Yes, of course. 2 centuries wait. No, seriously. But the health system is not just the public health system, just to be clear. The health system is all the actions and agents that deliver and try and improve health in a country. I mean, I like the fact that you were sort of saying one of your most successful program was this small-scale program. I think the challenge is to keep the secrets of those successes in terms of being really community-orientated, being small-scale, but scaling that. And I think that's what Avahan, I actually sort of evaluating Avahan, that's what I'd learned, because I'd come out of more of a public sector scaling environment, working in ministries of health. And I was skeptical that that could be done with community organizations. And what you saw in Avahan was it did cost a lot of money of the infrastructure above those community organizations to make sure they were well financed, that the capacity was built, that they were able to keep small, which perhaps is more expensive to deliver, but all those other things that make them work were in that financing structure. And we had a challenge when it came to then putting that top-end structure, not all those little organizations, but the top-end structure into the government structures. And I think that's where the greatest challenge is how can you transition that sort of systems infrastructure under government ownership and maintain the level of financing that you need to keep that small-scale activity community-focused. And that's not taking into account all the rights-based issues. And this is for governments who are willing to do that, let alone the issues of where that's not even possible. So I think that's the critical point, is when you do that transition. And before you do that, you need the right level of investment.
And Minister, linked to that, I mean, clearly you're doing that in Macedonia. How are you making that bridge between potentially core, sort of more standard sort of a vision of a health system and CBO delivered services, you know, at a scale? How are you figuring out those structures and making that work?
Well, we figure out that home-based services or community-based services are showing results. And this is where these preventive HIV programs, and especially after the social contracting presented some good results for our health system in general, not just on this level, as you're saying, of the public health. And then investing into the health system in general also creates an economic and social prosperity. You know, that every job created in the healthcare system is creating one more job out of the healthcare system. And this is well established. And it's already proven theory right now. Correct me if I'm wrong. And this is why we want to proceed in this manner. And this is why we want to expand the model of social contracting in some other fields of the primary healthcare, mostly, not just the HIV preventive programs. And this is how we see our prosperity in general of the society, not just of the healthcare system itself.
Right, good. Anna, you look like you want to respond to that.
No, I'm just agreeing. I mean, it doesn't just bring you. You learn a lot from, for example, Avahan on the way to do the social contracting, on what kind of mechanisms, and the rest of the health sector can gain from that, again, if you have the political willingness behind it. So I'm just being supportive.
Great. Okay, I've had the privilege as a chair to ask lots of questions. I'm now going to throw it out. I've got a gentleman up at number 4. I want to just take a few questions, and then we'll take it back to the panel. The Minister will need to leave at 3:30 just to alert people. So if you do have a question, particularly for the Minister, now's the opportunity. I'll take a few questions, we'll go back, and then we'll just keep the conversation going. Okay, so the gentleman at number 4 has been patiently standing, so please, and can I ask everybody just to keep questions quite short so we can feed it, we can, you know,
Sure.
fit in as many questions as we can. Go on.
Cipriano Martinez from Australia. I've got a couple of questions. One is, as countries go into low, middle to high transitioning, what are your reflections on the distribution of income? Because it's not enough for just the incomes of these countries to increase, but the distribution of income, and we know because of inequality that the distribution is actually declining. So even though some countries may appear to be more wealthier, the people that actually need it won't be getting the money. The other thing is, how do you reflect and handle the fact that the marginalised groups have very poor, if any, or zero electoral value in terms of their capacity to actually vote or not vote a particular government in and make them accountable? So as a result of their marginalisation, they are very small groups within populations. How does that happen, or what's your view on the best way to manage that? And the last comment is there a role for the World Bank to actually have a mandate to finance global health so that we don't have to keep on arguing about competing interests?
That was 3 questions, but good ones. Okay, let's go to mic number 3.
Thank you, Charlotte. This is Fern Terrace-Prestolt from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I have a question for Harley. As an AIDS economist for the past 18 years, you mentioned talking about broadening tax base, and Mark Dybel also mentioned this last week at the AIDS Economics Network meeting. Are you suggesting we should be stepping outside of our comfort zones and our silos and changing careers, or what can we do? Because it feels a little bit outside of our normal scope of work.
Great. And let's go to microphone 1, and then I'll come back to 3.
My name is Donna Diva. I come from Kosovo, and I am the alternate board member for Developing Country NGO delegation to the board of the Global Fund. I had a privilege meeting Minister of Health of Macedonia in Skopje board meeting, and I want again to extend our congratulations for the work that he and his government, along with the civil society in Macedonia, have done to ensure and sustain gains of the Global Fund by ensuring the financial needs. So my question would go to Minister first, but it can go to the panel at all. So by ensuring the resources, financial resources, and sustaining the gains of the Global Fund programs in continuation of services, are we really sustaining the services to the key populations if we do not take care and forget about the human rights and gender perspective? So talking about the political will, does the political will refer only to financial political will, or should that political will be broader? Because as I saw, and I think most of us here saw yesterday in the ILGA rainbow map, actually Macedonia is pretty reddish with regard to human rights for LGBTI community in Europe. So how much are we sustaining the gains if we are leaving aside the human rights, and if we are not trying to decriminalize and change the laws that would enable free access to the services? And that would also link to what Harley said in the upper middle income countries. So we do see the incidence rising among the key populations. So my question to Harley, and I know that he knows the answer, but how would you just tell to the public, how does the GNI per capita really reflect inequities in the countries with regard to key populations? Thank you.
Great, and I'm going to take number 2, and then I'm going to come back for another round, so I hope you bear with me. I just think we're getting a really long list now. So the gentleman at number 2.
Thank you very much. Steve Morrison from the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for really wonderful presentations. My question is about how to deal with the current turbulence that we face. And what I mean by that is we have pretty widespread populist nationalist movements now. We have regimes and we have elected governments, populist nationalist governments in London and in Washington. We have elected governments in Eastern Europe. We have electorates that are increasingly skeptical about foreign aid, and we have leadership that are actively involved, whether we're talking Brexit or we're talking U.S. engagement in the EU and NATO, where the post-war liberal internationalist order is dissolving as we look at this, and what comes next is very uncertain. And all of this has huge implications for going out and trying to raise money for institutions like the Global Fund, or to sustain bilateral engagements, or to convince governments, other governments, to do some of the things that you're talking about. So my question is, what's the strategy for dealing with this remarkable historical moment that we're in, which did not exist in the last, to the same degree, in the last replenishment? Thank you.
Great. So a really quite broad range of questions, really good questions. There's quite a few on politics, arranged from the political context to the political will around investing resource in and targeting at the most vulnerable when they might not have a huge amount of political capital, through to the related political issues around laws and policies that might be discriminatory. And then questions around the role of the World Bank, and should health economists get into tax? Okay, maybe I can go to the Minister first, because he does have to collect a plane, go onto a plane fairly soon. So I'll let him speak, and then we'll go to the others.
Well, as I mentioned, we certainly need to go towards legislation changes. What we want to see is making the vertical system of the social contracting, which is showing good result, a part of the whole healthcare system. And not just in this field, but in many other fields. And you know, it's very dynamic. Area is changing all the time. And I know the challenges of your country, they're pretty similar to what we are facing in Macedonia. And I'm pretty sure that when we destigmatize something that has been stigmatized for so much time, we're going to increase the level of innovations of the society. It's going to increase the potential of a new investment, not just from the side of the government, but also from other funders and other organizations. We need to do the legislation change because we're not supposed to rely on the goodwill of the political garniture which is running the country at a certain point of time. You know, some of the civil society organizations were in danger to be imprisoned from the previous government, and we're not supposed to allow this anymore. So this is why we're thinking towards legislation changes. We're thinking towards implementing civil society organizations as deliverers of the healthcare services in the country. We think that we are going to increase the access, and we are increase the quality of the healthcare, not just of the marginalized group, but of the whole citizens in our country.
Great, thank you. Do any others want to pick up on some of the questions?
You go first. I think a lot of them were for you.
Why don't you start then?
Okay, I'll do the easy ones, then you can do the
Super.
difficult ones. Okay. No, I just wanted to make.
If you could give me an answer on the strategy we should all take to raise money in this turbulent political
environment.
Well,
I only had an answer of like what not to do.
Okay.
Okay, and what not to do is to do it through raising fear of disease. And I do remember being part of discussions, and I've been part of some discussions in Washington about the fear of microbial threats and of disease being exported and importing, and that's what I would say. I don't think we should be taking advantage of those things, which we could do. So I don't think we should. So that's what not to do, and you can answer what to do. In terms of some of the other issues, I was going to come back on the tax base, and I'm sure you'll have a much more, say, sensible answer to this than me, but I think the reason people have been highlighting the tax base is not so much that the TB programs or HIV programs really could have a role there, but just to highlight that sort of we're in it in some countries for the long haul, that it's this big structural change that will really deliver the amount of resources we need to. And there's been a lot of conversation about innovative financing mechanisms and how we can raise additional resources. But I think people are trying to sort of retilt the balance slightly and be realistic about those new mechanisms, and highlighting that some of the older mechanisms and even a small shift in the tax base can actually potentially have quite high gains for diseases. And there are a couple of taxes that, you know, these analyses have focused on, which are tobacco tax and alcohol tax. And maybe there are certain areas, by joining up with other advocacy organizations and movements which are quite similar, where there could be some synergies. Now, of course, when you get to the Treasury, they don't want anything earmarked for anything. So accepting all that reality, Nevertheless, I think that's been the focus from HIV and TB. And again, I just come back to the inequity question. That's my last thing that I wanted to pick up on. I mean, I don't think there's a health system in the world that doesn't have inequities and issues. Now, there are specific issues around key populations, which we've talked about. But I think there are some things we can do, whether it's channeling direct assistance or whether it's supporting some of those governments' transition and not just focusing on efficiency, but in that transition, talking about equity and planning financing for equity. I think that would be something that we could usefully do. And at the moment, a lot of the transition is on sustainable financing and just raising money. So I think we could look at that sort of process of shifting. And I know that yeah, I'll leave it at that. I'm going to leave it to someone who actually is going to be able to do this rather than someone who
Okay,
challenge.
So I'll just pick up, I'll pick up on your point first about the not inciting fear of disease, and I'd have a qualification on that. I 100% agree if you're talking about not stigmatizing any populations as a result of fear. I would point out, though, that fear has been a prime motivating force for global health financing, basically from the colonial period, and that leaving that aside would pull away some of the warnings about XDR-TB, the warnings about malaria drug resistance. And if you look at where funding has moved in the past in relation to SARS, Ebola, other outbreaks, you clearly see the huge amount of financing leveraged with fear, with some problematic aspects of it, no doubt. But I think Bill Foege, who's helped eradicate smallpox, said tie the needs of the poor to the fears of the rich. And I think that raises some challenges for us, but is not advice easily dispensed with. Steve, on your, I don't have too much else to say on your points. It's a super hard question, Steve Morrison's question on what's the strategy for political turbulence? And I don't think we, at least I personally, don't have a strategy. I think we have a few tactics at best. It is worth noting that despite your pessimistic description of world events, which I largely ascribe to, these donors have maintained their funding so far. And so we have not entered into a crisis of financing at the moment. And so I think the tactics are something like maintain and keep your head down for now and see what happens. If we are really in a place where the liberal world order is collapsing, the dedication to global health and global development is evaporating, then the answer is to fight. But I don't have a broad strategy that gets us around this. I don't think anyone fully understands it yet. A couple of other points that were raised, I think you addressed the point, should we all change careers and work on domestic tax mobilization? Probably not all of us, but some of us should probably take a look at that. It's more of an IMF space than a global fund specific job, but if we don't do it, we're never going to have enough funds to make this work. If you look at strategy as defined in a simplistic equation as ends equals ways plus means, the ends we're really clear on. Ending the epidemics by 2030, where the global health community is probably too good at defining the ends, but without the other two pieces of the puzzle. We know the ways aren't enough. We know we don't have a vaccine yet. We know our interventions aren't effective enough. And the means is where we're really falling short, and that's why the domestic tax mobilization comes up repeatedly. We need significantly more financing, and if you actually had to, don't get me wrong, more financing for the Global Fund is spectacular, but a 5% increase in financing on domestic funds would make an enormous difference, much over what a 5% increase in Global Fund financing would. And then to Cipriani and Donna, your questions, yeah, there's no doubt. As countries move up in income status, inequality usually increases. To Donna, your question, GNI per capita is not a measure of either key populations or inequality. As you know, our board had a number of discussions on this particular question and have specifically addressed the moral hazard of giving countries more money in a reward for inequality. So we could add, so the Global Fund allocates funds based on burden of disease and level of income as measured by GNI per capita. So we do both. The points about how does it account for key pops, GNI is not a key pops measure. But we do use burden of disease as provided by UNAIDS and key populations incidence data when we do allocation. So that's how it's that's how it's reflected. How do we handle marginalized groups that have zero electoral value? I mean, part of the benefit of the Global Fund, I think, programs are advocacy. And so support for those groups to develop a voice and have a greater voice in the local community. But there's no doubt when they're small and stigmatized, this is really hard. And there is absolutely a role for the World Bank. I don't think you'll have no competing interest ever in global health. We're still a global health community. But the World Bank, the GFF, if we keep going to ministers of finance with an ask for HIV and an ask for TB and an ask for malaria and an ask for neglected tropical diseases and another ask for non-communicable diseases, and then other parts of the social sector, food security and energy and environment, all go to the finance minister for questions. They will do whatever they want to do in advance of all those people going in. If we start coming together, start talking about domestic tax mobilization, the World Bank has a role in this, I think we'll do better.
Great, thank you. The Minister needs to leave now, so can we just give him a round of applause and thank him for squeezing us in.
Thank you.
Okay, Anna, do you want to budge up one?
I'm not sure if I'm allowed. They have something, they told me I had to stay in this chair.
Oh,
but
you do?
as long as they are okay with that.
Okay, we're being disruptive, sorry. Okay, now we'll go back out to the audience. I'm going to go first to the woman, the lady there with the yellow dress, because she was patiently standing previously trying to get in, and then I'll come to mic number one.
Actually, on the relation between national and international funding, particularly the worry of some quite legitimate worry, I think, that international funding may displace domestic funding. And so, for example, that for every international dollar that is spent in a country, the domestic dollar is reduced. Now, of course, the co-financing arrangements that the Global Fund has in place are meant to work against that, but some think that may not be enough and that actually we need to do more in order to assure that the domestic funding stays at a level that is desirable. So the question really is to both panelists, do you think that health economics approaches are the way to go there, that we say, okay, the international funding should fund the interventions that are just not cost effective, that are just above the threshold, so will not receive domestic funding, or should there be other interventions or rules to decide on this issue? Thank you.
Great, okay, and to mic number one.
Yes, thank you. It's a shame that the minister left for the powerhouse panel. But there's still a lot of power still left, so we'll go with that. I'm actually going to bring a few points together and then ask the question, which I think is a really important and needed action question. One of the panelists have already said that when we talk about the public health system, it goes beyond the healthcare system, and we know that HIV is really part of a syndemic situation where we have many challenges, health and public health challenges, including substance abuse and other types of issues. And you've also already said that a lot of where the rubber hits the road, a lot of the work is done and effort is being made and progress made is at the local community-based organization and NGO level. And the title of this panel is HIV Resourcing and Sustainability. Yesterday there was a session that was on civil society under threat, how can HIV advocates resist the impact, and it has a longer title. Beyond that. And we heard person after person representing the organizations in country after country talking about the structural barriers that are being put in place that is basically eating at their ability to exist, whether it has to do with in-country fees, registering as foreign agents, new levels of surveillance. They, one after another, said it not only is having an internal impact, it's scaring off the international donors, and it really is a structural assault at collapsing the system. So while we talk about HIV resourcing and sustainability and how do we up the dollars, if this erosion is taking place within country at a structural level, I think, and we're not paying attention to it or we don't have an action plan, what should we do?
Great question, thank you. I'll go to mic number four.
Thank you. My name is Anders Nordström from Sweden. One reflection and one question. One reflection is that I think we're still in the mood, even if, like you said, the 5% increase of the Global Fund is not as important as a 5% increase of domestic resources. But we're still in the mood of thinking that we're going to solve the world's health problems with what we call aid. I think we need to wake up. That's definitely not the situation right now, and we need to take in reality that aid is getting more and more marginalized, less and less important, that we need to target aid more strategically and focus where it's most sort of effective. But I think we still haven't realized how health is financed, and we need to get those figures right. Second comment, more on the theme here in terms of competing priorities. What you haven't spoken about is NCDs. I mean, if you look into countries, what countries are faced today with is an epidemic, an explosion of NCDs. So if you talk about competing priorities for the Minister of Finance in countries, it's NCDs across the world, in the poorest countries as well. And we have the big meeting now in New York, the high-level meeting on NCDs. And my question is not so much how to manage the competition, potentially, but rather, can one see this also as an opportunity? And what could you think from an HIV/AIDS perspective? Because there is a lot of, in some way, parallel similarities in terms of what actually needs to be done in countries. Prevention, people living with chronic diseases. So the systems that are needed to tackle HIV in some way are quite similar to the ones that need to tackle NCDs. So can one in a more practical way also advise us, and most importantly then countries, in terms of how you actually could tackle both those agendas? Because that is the big competing priority for Minister of Finance that they are facing already now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to take one more, go back and then continue around. So microphone number 1, please.
Thank you. Roger McLean, representing the University of the West Indies at the Center for Health Economics. To my colleague, Hallie, I come from a region, the Caribbean, where we are, as you know, classified in large part as middle and upper income countries. And these are populations, with the exception of 2 or so countries, of less than 100,000, 50 or so. Some of the countries have been fortunate enough to be recipients of the Global Fund. Another characteristic of our region is that we are among the most susceptible to natural disasters. Mm-hmm. If you've been following the hurricane of the last hurricane season, you would have been privy to the devastation. This is in Kitts Nevis, Antigua Barbuda, Puerto Rico, etc., etc. What level of flexibility is there in the Global Fund submissions for countries who have been, countries like ours, who have been recipients of Global Fund grants, but have since been devastated by hurricanes, while still maintaining that high-income classification? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Another really good set of questions. So questions about international domestic financing. Are we getting substitution effects, creating the wrong incentives? Does aid actually really, should we really not thinking about that as the core way to tackle the epidemic? Are there opportunities of NCDs and other health areas? How do we stop thinking about them as competing agendas, but potentially joined up, getting more joined up? And then how do we tackle this issue of having a threshold when a country might face a severe shock and actually, it's ineligible given the current systems and processes? Okay, who wants to go first?
I'll go first, but I'm not going to answer all of them. So I'm going to answer the ones that I think I have something useful to say about. The question that was raised, I think, by Catherine about displacement. I mean, you're entirely correct, Catherine. I'm not sure where you're sitting, but at least some of the research, which is very controversial from the health economic side, and we can argue about it for ages, shows that at least at the health level there is displacement. I did see at the health sector level, I mean, displacements of development assistance for health, crowding out domestic assistance for health, and keeping those overall levels, the commitments we want on the domestic side. I did see some work presented earlier at this conference that said that was less of an issue within HIV, but I didn't really have a chance to judge the methods. I mean, my experience at the country level is it's not less of an issue for HIV, and the co-financing arrangements of the Global Fund are there to address it. But I also raised the question, how much of a problem is this, and what's the solution to it? So yes, the Global Fund can have co-financing arrangements and keep a certain amount for HIV, but money that's squeezed, sort of, if foreign aid is squeezing out domestic contributions, some of those domestic contributions may be used for NCDs, may be used for health systems, may be used for TBs that ought to improve the lives of people living with HIV. And again, I come back to the same thing. It's all about the right allocation across the health sector that's the most important thing. So the co-financing mechanisms support this. But again, we have to come back and look at the whole sector and think about that person living with HIV and the whole range of services they require. So it's a good question, but maybe the focus is broader than that. The other one I want to pick up on is, and it comes back to the same issue really, is the NCD question. So I think there is a lot of work looking not just at the financing side, but looking at the delivery platforms that can deliver all these interventions. And I know, at least from TB, but I suspect for HIV as well, that people who've been investing in, there has been this sort of tug of war between people who are investing in delivery platforms versus people who are interested in investing in specific diseases. Now, as I tried to show with the human resource slide, I think that has been counterproductive. If it's been counterproductive because both those two diseases need those platforms to be strong, and there are substantial economic gains from sharing those platforms. If we're repeating and duplicating things in a situation where we have very, very scarce resources, I'm not saying it's unethical, but it almost is, because our resources are so tight that we don't want to be duplicating things across programs. So I do think now is the time for the HIV world to start talking to NCDs, if that's what it takes to work together and talk about the platform and how we all link into it. I think now is the moment that has to happen, otherwise we're going to reach even more duplication. Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'll pick up on all those. I think on the NCD thing, Anders, you're right. I think the potential, as you said, for the delivery platforms, for the partnership is there. The one thing I think we have to guard against, and we have a bit of a reaction because of the glorious years of from 2000 to 2010 or 2008, where this incredible increase in global health financing, that our response to any burden of disease anywhere we find it is more aid. We need to start another global fund for XYZ, for road traffic injuries, for NCDs, for something else. Well, it's not like malaria, where the rich world has done a great job cleaning up malaria and eliminating it, and now we need to help some of the poorer countries in the world do that. The rich world, by and large, does a terrible job on NCDs. There are not crystal clear lessons learned that we can just export through aid to fix an NCD problem in poorer countries of the world. This is a policy challenge. This is a tax challenge. You mentioned sin taxes on tobacco and alcohol. And those are things that, at least in terms of my country, hasn't put in all of them. So I think that the policy response looks really different, but full agreement in terms of the potential synergies. And I saw a number of graphs this morning at the plenary in terms of the cascades for diabetes actually being much worse than the cascades for malaria in terms of diagnosed, linked to care, and actually on treatment. So there's a lot of room for work there. Anders, your other point on, I just fully agree, and you know we agree on this, that aid is not the solution. I hope you noticed the graph you showed earlier, where there was a little line at the bottom, which was development assistance, and then there's all of the other resource flows to middle-income countries that have vastly exceeded that. And that was what I was trying to get at in my intro comments about how the landscape has changed from when we were created. The only thing I'll note on the displacement comments from Katrina, I believe, was that we one of the things I love about the Global Fund is that we looked at that data on displacement 5-6 years ago when it started coming out and put in place co-financing requirements. And then when we learned and we had these conversations about you don't want, money's fungible, you don't want it just to pull it from vaccines or other investments. We introduced in the latest, actually in the sustainability transition and co-financing policy, graduated co-financing requirements. So at the low-income level, they're just for health. So we require increases in funding for health. So they can be for health systems, they could be for vaccines, they could be anywhere in that space. If we're honest, it still raises challenges across funding health versus other social sector needs. But as countries move up and get wealthier, what we were finding in upper middle income countries where you had a fully transgender epidemic, that the country was using childhood vaccinations as their co-financing requirements. And that really doesn't help sustainability at all. So in those places, we really do tie it quite tightly to needs. I have no doubt we have more lessons to learn on that, but that's what we've done. In terms of two final questions, the structural barriers and the declining civil society space. I don't think there's a global solution to that. One of the other things I like about the Global Fund is that we don't by and large implement these solutions from Geneva on the rest of the world. We have a huge amount of flexibility to fund what works the most in the specific country context. We were specifically created not to duplicate other bilateral programs, but to have a level of flexibility to bring together the countries and the country stakeholders, including the communities and people affected populations by the three diseases, with other bilateral donors and technical partners, Stop TB, Rollback Malaria, UNAIDS, WHO, and to design the most effective programs for that region. We also fund governments and we fund civil society. So the only thing I can hope for and expect out of our grants is that out of that pressure comes a response that's tailored to the country context. And then Roger, on the natural disasters, what kind of flexibility? We used to not have a lot of flexibility, and when we run around thinking about the next strategy, one of the things we heard very clearly was the Global Fund's really paperwork heavy and not a lot of flexibility. And we did take that on board. We can now reprogram grants very quickly. We have an emergency fund that's often we're one of the first financial responders to natural disasters and to other types of conflicts and emergencies. And if you really are having a problem, give me a call. We've really done our best to partner better with humanitarian actors and to introduce a whole new level of flexibility. There are limits to what we can do for grants of $500 million. We actually don't have too much flexibility about how our money's used and the accountability for it, but in terms of response to emergencies, we work really hard to be more flexible than we have in the past.
But isn't also around the threshold, and so how do you assess the economic, the GDP of a country when it's just been hit by a disaster? That was the point I thought he was asking.
Right, so we rely on an allocation formula that's very simple. We fund based on, the burden of disease and the capacity to pay. When we do the allocations, we don't usually flex it, although we do make qualitative adjustments up or down if a country has just entered into a crisis or something like that. And then again, we do have new mechanisms like the emergency fund, which can help provide kind of very fast commodity relief where countries have entered into crisis.
Okay, great. Okay, let's go around to the next set of questions. I'm going to go back. I'm going to start with three. So gentleman at number 3. Actually, yes, I think I keep on missing the person who's standing at the back. I think the lady standing next to you was patiently waiting. You guys work it out. Who wants to ask a question?
Thank you very much. I'm Gisela Schneider from Germany. Thank you very much for the presentations and discussion so far. I would like to come back to one of your first slides you showed, the cost of paying a community health worker. I think the role of the community, it's all of us very clear that the communities play a very, very important role. And for many, many years, we've been fighting on community volunteers, how much can we afford, how much can we pay them. And it's good to see them finally move up into the category that they become part of the formal health system and being paid. But even $50, if you calculate it for every village in any type of country, that's a huge amount of money. And how can that be sustained? Because that's often the problem, that is not sustained and then it collapses. And at the end of the day, I think the community, at the community level, is where things come together. That's where the NCD patient is treated. That's where the HIV patient gets a treatment. And that's why I like the discussion of today and this morning to say the HIV community needs to move out of the silo and break the silo open and really discuss on the broader health sector issues, although HIV is broader than the health sector. We have issues that we need to deal with, and that's why the money there shouldn't be a competition for the money, but we should be leveraging what can be learned from HIV, because I think we've done a lot of silos in the countries, and it's cost the midwife here and the nurse there, and it could be the same person doing the same thing, paying only one salary at a time. So there's a lot of leverage if you really synergize and bring things together and build a strong and resilient system. However, I would like to remind us of the Primary Healthcare Declaration of 1978, which many of us in this room know very well, but we very often overread when the people, our fathers in a way, have asked for a new economic international order, whatever they meant at the time, but I think they looked at more equity. and a more, not just solidarity to bring something from the rich to the poor, but restructuring needs to be done if we really want to reach UHC. And I think I hear a lot of talk, but nobody's really touching on that there are structural issues also in the North, that if they are not touched, we will never, ever make a difference. At least that's what I feel. Thank you.
Thank you. And to mic number 4.
Beatrice Stickers from KNCV Tuberculosis Foundation in the Netherlands. One of the topics that I've not heard addressed is on procurement of drugs, which is a big component of the fight against HIV and TB. And in the course of transitioning out of donor funding, there's an issue with availability of drugs, price and quality. This is particularly so in TB drugs, where the drug market is very fragmented, but it's true for many other areas as well. My question is, how do you see your role at both the Global Fund and as a donor like DFID in advocating the policy and driving the policy change that are necessary at country level, so that the regulatory adjustments are made for continued access to pooled procurement or, well, many of the things that we have in place. Secondly, also at global level and connecting that country level work to the global level. At the UNHLM, we have a great opportunity on TB to really put this issue at the table and get donors and the global community embracing this issue and seeing solutions which are going to save money as well as contribute to sustainability. Then I had one small other thing, which is also about how do you see your role as an advocate, perhaps more to the Global Fund. It was mentioned, do we all have to change to fiscal economics? But I think there's a big linking role that we from the health field can play, because indeed it is the IMF, it is the World Bank who are the bigger voices in this, but we may need to help say what is it that you need to get to sustained programming. And so there's a lot of institutional advocacy that may be needed.
Great, thank you. And go back to number 3.
Thank you so much. In 2001, African countries, they met and they agreed that they are going to make sure that they finance health. They allocate 15% of their budget to health. Some countries are doing well, others are not doing well. So my question to the panelists is, in this era, where I've seen the shrinking donor basket, what are we doing to motivate them or to incentivize them to work towards that, and especially that we are encouraging that, we should have higher local financing. Thank you.
Okay, and we'll go to mic number 4, please.
Thanks to the speakers, Millie Kayongo, USAID. My question is for Anna. First of all, thank you for raising the profile of human resources for health, because I think it's something which is often not as highlighted in discussions on sustainability. But when you're talking to governments around human resources and increasing the investments in that, the argument is often that they're doing as much as they can within the constraints of their physical space. And so I was just wondering whether from your research in other countries, you might have perhaps some thoughts on compelling arguments that have either worked or successful programs on how you get governments to invest more in human resources when they feel they're already doing enough. In many governments, the wage bill is a substantial component of what they're already spending on health, and there's almost seems like no way that they can expand it given the resources in the country. Thank you.
And mic number 3.
Thank you very much to the panel and also to some really provocative questions from the audience. My name is Ian McFarlane. I work for UNFPA, the UN Agency for Sexual and Reproductive Health. I'd like to ask the panel for their comments on the potential linkages between prevention and sustainability. And just a caveat, I asked a similar question in another panel, and the answer was, yes, we're going to fund PrEP. What I mean is whether that's great, that's really great, but also the broader sense of prevention in terms of education, access to modern contraception, etc., etc. If you'd have any comments on that, I'd really value those. Thank you.
Great, another really good round of questions, and I'm, keep at it, panel. You're doing brilliantly. I mean, just the breadth of the questions, it's amazing. It's fantastic. Anyway, there's one on primary healthcare and commitments. There's issues of human resources, the issue of pricing commodities. Is that an option to really use the international system to pull prices down and provide opportunities for saving? We've got issues about how do we support governments to actually meet the commitments they've made to investing in health, and prevention being more than PrEP, and actually what are the real opportunities or ways we could be thinking that tap into the SDGs and the broader ambition for development when we know many structural drivers give us a prevention benefit. Okay, who wants to go next?
I'll go because I get to choose the ones I answer.
Okay,
then
all right. There's a strategy going on here.
You can come back and then I can. So the first one, which I think was directed to me, was the one about community health workers. Now, clearly, there are non-financial ways of motivating community health workers, and community health workers are not entirely motivated by finance. And I didn't take you through the sort of details of the slide, but that's what we were also trying to work out, is that there is a sort of value to volunteering as well. I think the real issue is, as you say, as programs expand, because when programs start and no one's using community infrastructure, perhaps there are idle resources within communities which can easily be brought into volunteering. As we demand more of communities, in a sense, and I'm going to use an economic term here, the marginal cost or the cost of recruiting that extra worker or that extra community volunteer becomes higher, because you tend to be taking them away from a pool of people who may have other things they're doing. So the price rises. So I think that is an issue. It's not just about paying people the correct salary. We're going to face, as was correctly said, an increasing cost of community health work or community contributions. In terms of sustaining that, as I say, there's many, many studies out here looking at mobile technologies, different types of technologies, and one of the key issues has been the lack of retention in the community health workforce. But again, some of those have shown modest improvements in retention, but I still come back. I think it's going to be hard not to actually offer people decent financial incentives in addition to all the basic incentives that they're going to need in terms of being valued for the work they do. Where's that money going to come from? It's clear. I think in Uganda we made the calculations. I don't think the Ministry of Health in Uganda was that pleased with the calculations, as they said, but for a long time, health sectors have allocated, we've talked about allocations between inputs, we've talked about allocations between diseases. What we haven't really talked about is allocations between different levels in the health sector, and how much money is going into tertiary care and even high-level hospital care compared to community and preventative services. And at least in the whole, sort of my whole career experience, that's the thing we haven't shifted. So that money doesn't necessarily have to come from the community TB worker. It can actually come from the top-level tertiary care, and that may be good value for money. So I don't think sustainability. It's also, again, I come back to reallocations and what are the important ones. I'm going to also ask the question, that the human resource question again. I think this is a long-standing issue. And I will admit I did this work in South Africa recently, but my experience is slightly old in this respect. But you're entirely right. It's the IMF and the public sector wage bill that often constrains the extent of human resource, the extent to which you can increase human resources to health. And in the past, governments have tried to address this problem in terms of getting those salaries outside of the public sector wage bill. So Zambia, for example, 15 years ago, and everyone will bitterly remember this, created a central board of health, for example, where those workers could be employed separately and not be picked up in the IMF sort of rules of fiscal sustainability. Those options are still there. I think the IMF is often looking at the sort of public sector employment liability. But it's been many years since those have been revisited, and I would recommend, you'd need to speak to someone who is more updated on that than me. I think I'm going. I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to come back after. Okay. I've got a couple more points, but I'll leave it for you.
I'm going to start with a question you didn't ask, but I'm surprised you didn't ask, which is why is the Global Fund abandoning middle-income countries? It's a question we get asked a lot, and so I'm going to give you 2 pop quizzes. Because I think facts are really important here. The first question is, what percentage of the last Global Fund allocation went to middle-income countries? So what does abandon look like in that context? Give me a percent, 0 to 100. What percent went to middle-income countries? I heard 50. Okay, that doesn't sound like abandoning, but okay.
Any up or down?
Please, just yell. It's the AIDS conference, like, 5%, 14. Others? 12. Okay, we're at 49%. Okay, so actually some of our biggest grants are in the large high-burden countries that have recently moved from low-income status to middle-income country status. I sense a question coming. I'll just say the Nigerias, the South Africas, the Kenyas, the Ghanas, the Pakistan for TB, those types of countries. Why don't I let you jump in with a question then?
Yeah, go on.
First pop quiz, if that's okay.
I'll do my best.
That 50% of the 49% of the funding, how many middle-income countries did that go to?
That is a really good question. The Global Fund, I can actually deliver on this one. The Global Fund's every low-income country. It funds every lower middle-income countries eligible. That's 50 out of 50. And the Global Fund funds 41 out of 56 upper middle-income countries. The only ones the Global Fund does not fund are upper middle-income countries that have low burdens of disease. So our transition happens at the lower middle-income country level. When they get to upper middle-income, when they have a low burden of disease as defined by our technical partners.
So I guess the point I'm subtly trying to make is that 50% of that funding goes to a lot more middle-income countries than the 50% that goes to low-income countries, because there are fewer low-income countries.
Yes, that's absolutely right. There's more middle-income countries than before. There's also, of course, on the other side, less ability to pay for the 3 diseases and health systems in those low-income countries.
Yeah, I'll sit down now. But we did a piece of research at Stop AIDS, which basically looked at how much more on average a lower middle-income country gets compared to a low-income country, and I cannot now remember what it was, but there was a significant difference in the average amount of money that a lower middle-income country got compared to a low-income country because of the smaller number of low-income countries. So just wanted to throw that back when we're giving pop quizzes.
Excellent, much appreciated. Last pop quiz for you. What's the total amount of Global Fund funds? So we allocated about $10.3 billion in the last cycle. What's the total number of millions of dollars that are actively in transition now? So there are 11 countries actively in transition now. Is that how much of the $10.3 billion do you think is actively in transition? So in their last Global Fund grant, how big a problem is this? I want millions of numbers. I see Anders making a small sign. As you can tell by my tone, that's probably the direction it's going, so there's a hint. Guesses on numbers of millions. What is the Global Fund's scale of transition? Out of 10.3 billion, it's 60 million.
Any other views? You've got 60 on the table.
It's a really good guess. 35 million. So we're talking about 11 countries where the needs are really serious. I mean, Macedonia was one of them recently. And the people affected in those countries have really serious challenges, and that's why we put in place all this preparatory work. But I just think it's important both to look at the scale of the funding and the continued funding for middle-income countries. So I didn't want to leave the panel without getting that across. A couple other points in answers to your actual questions, and my apologies, thank you for your indulgence. Beatrice, there's no doubt that TB procurement is particularly challenging because of the fragile market, because of the small purchase sizes. But I will point out that this isn't new. Your data presented earlier, TB is what, 85% domestically funded? This is not a new thing. This is not a transition thing. This is not a Global Fund transition thing. It's something we do have to work on. Our role is really clear. I mean, in those transition readiness assessments, flagging the procurement challenges is really critical. We've got a couple of mechanisms we work with GDF, we've got some pooled procurement at the Global Fund. There are clearly access to medicines issues that occur in this space as well. But this is something we can and need to work on so that countries either can procure on their own or can procure through international mechanisms. There's some major challenges here. A lot of countries have rules against international procurement with domestic funds, so they're not allowed to do it. So even though GDF or the Global Fund or another financer can offer procurement for them, it's legally prohibited from doing it. In other cases, you've got prioritization of domestic production facilities. And so, and there's occasionally, I know you'll be shocked to hear, corruption in terms of that. Someone knows somebody who owns a factory that produces these products. So there's some major challenges we face in that space, but it's not new, and we've got to give a lot of attention to it. I don't know how to answer your question as the role of advocate. It's different things and different issues in different places. Sometimes we're full-throated in terms of key pops, in terms of human rights barriers. Sometimes when you have countries enacting anti-MSM laws, we take that advocacy a little bit more behind the scenes and make sure our programs and the people who benefit from them are protected. But we've clearly got a strong advocacy role. The only thing on the gentleman's question on co-financing, what else do we do? In addition to the co-financing requirements, I'll just add we're quite serious about them. And we literally have taken away funds from countries when they don't meet their co-financing requirements. This is really hard. This cuts back at the degree of impact we could have, but it recognizes the changing financing landscape where the Global Fund cannot do this alone. And if we're not helping, and in some cases putting a little more pressure on countries to step up, we're not going to make it. And so that's what we do. The final point before I'll turn it back over is on the prevention and sustainability. I'm actually really excited about PrEP. I think the answer you got was really good. But I think it is probably broader than that. I think you could think about financial sustainability, which we've talked a lot about today, in terms of how you get enough funds at scale between domestic resources and efficiencies and continued donor financing. But you also need to think about programmatic sustainability, and here's where really prevention comes in. If we don't get ahead of the incidence curve on these epidemics, the cost will go up. And you could define programmatic sustainability as actually just ending these epidemics so we can save more lives and move along. And I think we do and need to continue to look at both. But that's where I think prevention really comes in. If we're not getting ahead of that incidence curve, we're not saving as many lives, the financial sustainability gets worse. And that's one of the reasons where we really need to step up our efforts on prevention.
Great. I mean, I'm sadly, we've got lots of more people wanting to ask questions. We're coming up close to 4 o'clock. I'm going to give Anna a chance just to give any kind of final comments.
Okay.
Any thoughts?
No, I was just going to respond to one of the other questions, if that's okay, quickly, but I'll be very quick. No, someone said we don't all have to become fiscal economists with the advocacy case. Well, I think HIV has actually done really well, and the HIV programs, they've had a lot of support and actually are very competent in terms of making economic arguments for HIV. But I wanted to speak to the lady and others in the audience who are sort of interested in TB. I think TB has not done this at all and has lost out because of this. And I think there will be a bit of an arms race as these arguments become so. We have to be careful. We have to be careful that those who are doing more economic analyses don't de facto get more resources. And where that is relevant, I suppose, for HIV, and as an area, Charlotte, you've worked a lot in, is about structural drivers for HIV, where we've had much stronger, it's much easier to produce economic evidence around direct treatments and biomedical intervention. It's been much, much harder, so this relates to the prevention question, about investments around prevention and particularly structural drivers. So I think we should become fiscal economists, but we should also be aware that we don't want sort of the best economists to always win out.
Right, okay. All right, on that note, we don't want the best economists to win out. We need to call it a day now. I'm sorry for those of you who've stood up and I'm sure have really good questions. I just want to end by really sincerely thanking the panelists. They've been brilliant. I mean, the breadth of questions they've been challenged with, I think they've answered really well. We put on this session, so Jonathan and I are able, as Tracky organisers, to choose a few sessions that we want to run. And we really wanted to run this session because we wanted to have the conversation that starts us getting to really think about where are we now? What does the world look like? What will it look like in the future? Where we have the Sustainable Development Goals, when we have a range of competing health priorities, to really try and, within the AIDS conference, which can be a bit of a bubble, to really start saying, what does the world look like, and then how do we respond? And how do we think about, rather the SDGs or universal health coverage, being a threat, to say what are really the opportunities that gives us as a community, and particularly when we know there are potentials for synergies across investments in different types of health, but also opportunities more broadly around the Sustainable Development Goals of helping us tackle the structural drivers. I think we've just started the conversation here. Clearly, there's a lot of appetite and energy around continuing that conversation. I've loved the way that people have brought together both evidence and experience from the ground. We had political leadership as well with the Minister of Health from Macedonia here. So yes, let's hope it's the start of the conversation. I really want to thank you all for coming and for such a great and lively debate. And again, thank you both for answering all the questions and really being very, I think being very open as well. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.